Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Gambling is a Co-Occurring Disorder, with Fred Feta and Jeremy Wampler. I'm Lori Manson. I'm the Problem Gambling Services Coordinator at AdCare. Just wanted to say we're really happy to present this webinar today in collaboration with our partners at the Maine Council on Problem Gambling, with funding from the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I have a little bit of housekeeping. For today's webinar, we are taking attendance since we are offering certificates with continuing education credit. So after this meeting's over, I will run a Zoom report and it will tell me who was on and how long they were on for. So please don't log out early or it will impact your certificate. Later on today, I'm going to email you a link to an evaluation, and it's very short. We really appreciate it if you take the time to fill it out. It helps us understand what you liked and what you found useful. And also what we could do to improve the experience for future participants. I'll email you the certificate in about 5 business days. So if you don't get it by this time next week, feel free to send me an email and we'll figure out why. Please notice the chat button on your Zoom controls. While Fred and Jeremy are presenting, if you have a question or comment, go ahead and type it into the chat section. We'll be monitoring it throughout the webinar. If for some reason you're not able to access that chat feature, you could shoot me an email. I know that I've sent you a bunch of emails lately, so you should have my email address. You could send me an email and I'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar as well. So we're very pleased to have Fred Feta and Jeremy Wampler with us today. Fred is the Clinical Director of Problem Gambling Services with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services in Connecticut. And Jeremy is Clinical Manager of Problem Gambling Services for the State of Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. I met Fred and Jeremy about a year ago. It was last summer at a Gambling Awareness 101 course that they were the instructors for at the Summer School of Addiction Studies in Worcester. I had only been in this position for a few months at that time. Were you forgetting that, Jeremy? I just heard you go,
Yeah, I did.
I had only been in this position for a few months at that point, so I was consuming any educational activity that I could find, not only to increase my knowledge, but also so that I could be scouting for trainers to bring to Maine. So as soon as I got back to Maine, I told the folks at AdCare and at the Maine Council that it would be great if we could talk Fred and Jeremy into coming to Maine to present for us at some point. So that resulted in a conversation this fall, and Fred and Jeremy agreed to come be presenters at the annual conference on problem gambling here in Maine. And unfortunately, that was not to be. So they have agreed to do this webinar for us instead. So we're very appreciative of that. And we also hope that as soon as things get back up and running, that we can talk them into coming to visit us in person and to do a much longer in-depth in-person training. So Fred and Jeremy, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you. It's unfortunate that I didn't get the pleasure of coming to Maine. I was looking forward to it. I've never been to Maine, and it looks like a lovely state. Coming from Connecticut, where it's a little bit congested and compact, and I like the idea of going out into the wilderness a little bit and exploring our beautiful country. But in due time, I'm sure we will get an opportunity. So I'm Jeremy Wampler. I'm the clinical director, or the clinical manager for Problem Gambling Services in Connecticut, that was mentioned. And we oversee the pretty much the state, the grant that serves anything problem gambling related. So we have clinical treatment programs, we have disorder gambling integration programs, which we'll discuss later on. And then we also have our prevention work. We have the opportunity to work alongside the industry in some projects to work on gambling awareness in the community. So we kind of have our hands in a lot of different pots. And it's really nice to be able to partner with so many folks. And then we also get the opportunity, because gambling is a small community, to partner with other states such as Maine, Massachusetts. We have a Northeast Consortium, we call it, where a lot of different professionals come together, and we kind of support each other and provide technical assistance to each other around problem gambling and how to further our field and provide the best quality services as possible. So that's me. I've been in the problem gambling field for, I don't know, maybe 12 years or so. I, like many people, started my career working in substance use and mental health treatment facility in a city called Waterbury in Connecticut. And through that work, I got the opportunity to work with problem gambling. And from there, I really just got a passion for the work. And that's where my career led me. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to come and to speak. So thank you all. And I will stop talking about myself and we will move on with the rest. Actually, you know what? Fred, how about you give yourself, introduce yourself? Sorry.
No problem, Jeremy. I'll do a real quick introduction. Like Jeremy, I work for the Problem Gambling Services for the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services in Connecticut. And, you know, looking forward to present today. I know we only have an hour now, so we're going to go through the material as concisely as possible. And, you know, we'll try to answer questions as we go along or save some for the end, but really excited to be here. Jeremy's going to lead us through the beginning part, and I'll take over as we head into the path.
Great, thank you, Fred. So that's our opening. So we're gonna a few learning objectives. I mean, this is a pretty short presentation. We do this presentation typically in a half day or a full day setting, but we've been able to kind of boil it down to its essence. And so this is going to be a broad overview, but hopefully at the end of this hour, you'll learn a bit about the progression of gambling addiction from non-use or abstinence all the way up to the disordered state that's DSM diagnosable. You'll list a couple of reasons why it's important to include gambling awareness into the work that you're doing already. You may not know it or may not have recognized it, but there are folks in our midst who are dealing with problem gambling. We may not even have addressed it with them, or they may not address it themselves. And then we're going to list 3 ways to integrate gambling questions into your agency practice to help you facilitate some of the conversation that will lead, hopefully, to more fruitful dialogue with your clients and with those that you're interacting with. Before we start, what we like to do is we like to define gambling, because there's so many things that we say everything is a gamble, right? We say, you know, waking up in the morning, traffic. I don't know, in Maine, I would imagine like maybe how many moose you're going to see. I don't know. Sorry, the stereotype, but but there's all kinds of things that we say is a gamble. And for this purpose, we really want to be specific and talk about betting money or material goods on an uncertain outcome in the hopes of gaining more money or material goods. So it's very specific on some tangible type of items, and it's all around taking a risk. So we're going to take a little poll, and bear with me. And take a few minutes, and you should see it. I hope. Does everybody see it? There we go.
Mm-hmm. I would read it, Jeremy, too, just in case there are any folks who are on the phone and wondering what the poll question
sorry
is.
about that. So the poll says, in comparison to the general population, how much higher is the prevalence of disordered gambling for clients working through mental health and substance use disorders? So it looks like we have a strong contingency of people who are weighing on 5 times. So the options are 1 time, 2 times, 5 times, or 10 times. And we have a lot of people saying 5 times, more so than the other. We'll give it about 5 more seconds.
Hi, this is Barbara. I'm not getting the options to make a choice with. I'm only getting just video in progress.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to help you, but
That's okay.
sorry about that. The beauty of technology is sometimes it fails us. So unfortunately.
That's fine. No worries.
So I ended the poll, and let's share the results. And as you can see, about a majority of folks, 54%, found or think that it's 5 times the rate. We have 28% say 2, 2% say 1, and 16% say 10. So let's move forward and we'll find out who is correct. Now you might have to X out on your screen. I'm not sure how it looks on your side of the world.
It just fades eventually.
Okay. Nice gradual fade, like a sunset. So this is how it lands. So, you know, just like I mentioned in the opening, gambling lives on a spectrum or a continuum, just like we see with substance use, you know, where you have anywhere from the, you know, people who abstain, who don't participate, all the way up to folks who end up having problems with it or develop a gambling disorder. But general population, about 95% of people fall in the no gambling to just to the edge of the problem area. So a majority of people can participate in this behavior and not have a problem. So I think this is where it's really important to say that, you know, we are, you know, knowing this fact, you know, we are gambling neutral. You know, we don't, we're not anti-gambling. What we are all about is educating people about the risk, because there is a risk involved. But we know about 95% of people don't develop a problem. Sometimes people ask about professional gamblers and where a professional gambler may fit. And a professional gambler, if you're not familiar, you know, is like your professional poker player over the past decade. Texas Hold'em and things like that have become you know, glamorized, and it's on ESPN and all these other things. So professional gamblers, I would say, it's a high risk profession because they are constantly exposing themselves to the stimulus and to the behavior and to all the risks. So they're higher on the spectrum, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're problem gamblers. You know, think about a professional gambler. Oftentimes they're sponsored. They're playing with sponsorship and money. They're not playing with money, you know, that they can't afford. So they do play within many times within that safe realm. But all that being said, we do see some people come into the program who have been professional gamblers and end up developing a gambling problem. And you think about somebody who's a professional gambler all the time, may feel like they have an advantage. You know, they know the game a little bit better than your average player. And sometimes they discount the odds of actual gambling. You know, gambling, a lot of times, you know, the odds are often stacked against the player, especially in a casino environment or lottery. So even though you may know the risks and you may know the game, doesn't mean necessarily that you're guaranteed to come out on top. And about 3 to 4% of folks develop a problem. So, you know, this may meet 1 or 2, you know, a few of the DSM criteria, but, you know, haven't really gone off the deep end or, you know, developed a significant issue. And then about 1 to 2% have a gambling disorder. So, you know, you think about it, it seems kind of small, but if you start attaching numbers to it, it starts to grow quite significantly. And then there's a study or some information out of the National Council on Problem Gambling that talks about for every problem gamblers, about 8 people affected. So now, we're talking about much greater amount of folks who either have a problem themselves or are negatively affected by somebody else's gambling. So certainly is a pretty large issue in that respect. And then down here toward the bottom, you'll see that there are a couple subpopulations that are much higher risk. We know from our work with substance use, mental health, that youth oftentimes are at much higher risk than older adults. And this holds true with gambling. They're about 2 times the rate of problem gambling or disordered gambling as their adult counterparts. Folks who are in substance use and mental health, here's the answer to your poll, about 10 times the rate of the general population. And so you're talking about, instead of 1 to 2% with gambling disorder, we're talking about 15 to 20%. So you think about if you're running a group with 10 people, and I know many people are running groups larger than 10 people, but just for the sake of math, and I'm not a mathematician, that's why I chose social work. So group of 10, you have 2 people in that group that maybe have a gambling disorder. So again, it's important to discuss it, and chances are they probably never talked about it with anybody, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. But it's important to include it into your work, and Fred will talk about how you go about doing that. And then this last piece is the Department of Correction population. So folks involved with the criminal justice system who are incarcerated, they have rates about 20 times. There was a study in 2004, I believe, or 2014, I'm getting a little fuzzy on my numbers, from the Department of Justice, and they found that this was the case. They found about 33 to 35% of folks who were incarcerated at that time met criteria for a gambling disorder. We in Connecticut did a study a couple years ago where we were able to survey people who were incarcerated, and we found this to be true in Connecticut as well. So about 33 to 35% of people that were incarcerated had a gambling disorder. And a lot of people are a little surprised by this, because they're saying, well, if you're incarcerated, how do you have a gambling disorder? And if you're familiar with that population, there's lots of things. Remember, it's money or material goods. So they're gambling for commissary, and they can pretty much bet on anything. Cockroach races, sporting events, who can do, almost like youth, a lot of task things. How many push-ups can you do? And all kinds of things that pass the time. And although it's prohibited in the Department of Correction rules, it's often allowed, because it is a way of keeping people occupied. And as long as nobody's losing and fighting, it keeps people it gives them something to do. So it's something that we started to address in our state just because of the adverse consequences. So we're going to talk a little bit about gambling and co-occurring disorders. So this is from NIDA, and this is kind of the diagram of the brain, the addicted brain, or described addiction in the brain. And you can see in the middle of the brain, where all those little arrows are, that's the pleasure center. And once you ingest a chemical, take a drug, it activates that that part of the brain, and it releases all the endorphins and the dopamine. It floods the front of the brain, which is the executive functioning and reasoning and motor skills and all these other things, and it kind of flows backwards. And what we found, and what they found through brain imaging and the neuroscience, is that so drugs, it takes the chemical to cause this reaction. Gambling, just participating in the behavior, is able to stimulate that reaction in the brain. And we see the same sort of process happening. And as we know with substances, same holds true with gambling, where when you start to take away the gambling, the brain starts to require that behavior to activate that process. That's what causes the cravings. When that's reduced or taken away, the brain's like saying, hey, where is this thing? 'Cause I need this stimulus. So the brain functioning starts to not work as it should. And that's where we start to develop some problems and some significant addiction. So I think it's also important to keep in mind for folks in early recovery that it takes a while for the brain to recalibrate and to go back to functioning as normal or as it should. So the early recovery process is very similar. And this just for those who are research minded, these are from the APA, and it talks about drugs activating this reward system like we just discussed, and then they find that gambling activates this reward system, which kind of led to a movement within the DSM, and we'll talk a little bit about that change and how significant that change was to our field and to the work that we do. And this again is this is from Rachel Volkow of NIDA, who does a lot of brain neurobiology research. And this just kind of highlights in fMRI scans, you know, the brain activity, and it shows on the left-hand side the functioning of a healthy brain, and then you have your addicted brain. So you can see where these motor skills and these activities are altered just by the exposure and the ongoing exposure to this behavior. And you can see how you might start to see some challenges when you're assisting somebody or helping them through the recovery process. You know, when these active centers are not functioning as they should. You may hear clients say, you know, I used to really enjoy X activity, you know, riding mountain bikes or spending time with my family, and I just don't feel that level of enjoyment anymore. And a lot of it's because the brain needs to have that recalibration time. And you can see on this bottom slide, which I like it kind of above view, where you can see in the middle of the brain, on a healthy brain, you have some on the left-hand side, you have some activity through pleasure activities, and on the right side, there's nothing going on there. So, you know, again, it takes some time, but it certainly affects how the brain functions. So this is, you know, again, it brings some validity to gambling as addiction. Because, you know, for many, many years, people didn't necessarily understand how a behavior or how gambling can be an addiction. And we would hear terms that were negative and stigmatizing, like degenerate gamblers. And we hear a lot of folks, you know, family members and friends saying, well, why don't you just stop, as if it was just will-based. And here is a great example of, you know, there's much more going on than just willpower. So folks who are dealing with, you know, vulnerable populations dealing with gambling have higher rates of relationship problems, financial problems, including bankruptcy. You know, bankruptcy is very common. Obviously, this is an addiction that involves money. So, you know, people can go through quite a bit of money in a little bit of time. And you know, it's really how much money that somebody can go through is dependent upon access and obviously financial socioeconomic status. Legal problems, you know, we see a fair amount of folks who commit illegal acts to fund their gambling, work performance, poor general health. You know, a lot of the same things that you would see that you're already used to seeing with folks who are dealing with substance use issues. And then this last bullet is really important, and I understand there'll be another webinar in the future, which I recommend that you attend, is about suicide. Yes, gambling has the highest rate of suicide of any other addiction. So it's a very significant factor that we constantly assess for in the work that we do. And this slide just kind of briefly highlights, and it shows, you know, this first bullet, you know, talks about the general population and the rates of suicide. And then the second bullet talks about substance use. And the substance use research is starting to come around, and it's starting to find that it's about 1 in 5 as well. So it's about on par. So we used to say that gambling has the highest rate, but we're starting to see that substance use is starting to edge up there. Not that it's a competition that anybody wants to be participating in. And then with gambling, now gambling in the DSM, gambling is the only addiction that mentions suicide. So if you look at the substance use stuff, there's no mention of suicide, and gambling actually does. So again, that's another significance. About up to 50% of treatment people in treatment. So there's a lot of people who don't end up in treatment, but the people that were in treatment, 50% had suicidal ideation, quite significant, and about 17% actually had attempts. So very high rates. And I don't think it's in this presentation, but it's also significant. It's so significant that in the 20 questions of GA, number 20 asks about suicidal ideation, and none of the other fellowships, AA, NA, mention suicide at all. So again, it's that prominent that it's being addressed in self-help and also in the clinical realm. And here is a slide that we borrowed from Massachusetts. And here you see, on the right-hand side, this gentleman sitting at a bar. And then on the right-hand side, he's sitting at a slot, kind of an old school slot machine. They don't really look like that anymore. But it's still fitting because you can just put in there, a lot of states have Keno at bars. So a person could be at a bar, play Keno. And it's nice because it just highlights that, there is, people often will transfer from one addiction to another. They may start out with alcohol, may transition to gambling, but it also speaks to the fact that it's an addiction, be it alcohol, gambling, and 75% have an alcohol disorder, 38% have a drug disorder, and 60% are nicotine dependent. And this one, again, just kind of highlights the importance of addressing gambling as a co-occurring disorder. It talks about impairment in decision-making. Again, it affects the prefrontal cortex. So, that prefrontal lobe where, the executive functioning, decision-making, rational decision-making is impaired, and that allows people to take more risks. So they may make more risks, more irrational risks, and end up developing an issue. And this is another slide that just speaks to the co-occurring nature and how predominant. 56% with a mood disorder, 60% anxiety. This slide, 57 to 82%, which is a wide range of other. The other disorder was diagnosed first. So a lot of times, and this last slide talks about, a lot of times people are coming into our treatment system, and we are, no fault to us, but we're programmed, to look for what we're addressing. So if we're working in a substance use program, we're looking for substance use issues. So we do a really good job at assessing for what we're familiar with. And, this was really eye-opening for us in Connecticut, and we actually developed a program to address it because it just shows that people are coming into our treatment system, they're getting help for all their other needs, but they're walking out and they're not getting treated for the gambling disorder. And we know that if we're not treating the whole person, we're leaving them open to a recidivistic event for a relapse because we're not addressing all of the core issues. So really important to integrate it, to add some evidence-based screening and to have some conversations. And Fred will talk about that in a few minutes. And as mentioned before also, a big change happened with DSM-5. Gambling disorder has been in the DSM since DSM-3 in the early 80s. But from DSM-3 to DSM-4, gambling lived in a impulse control disorder section in the mental health section of the DSM. And, it lived with pyromania, kleptomania, trichotillomania. And for many, many years, us who are working in the field said, this is not really impulse control. This really is an addiction. With the treatment that we use is the same treatments that we use for addiction, apply for gambling. But finally, the research showed up, caught up, some of the brain imaging, some of the key researchers in our field we can thank for, really bringing this to light, bringing this to the APA. And they made this shift. So they reclassified, at the time it was called pathological gambling, and they moved it to a to addiction category. And currently it's the only behavioral addiction or non-substance related addiction in the addiction category. There are a few that are up for review. Video game playing is up for review, hypersexuality, compulsive shopping, all these things are up for review, but right now gambling is the only behavioral addiction in that category. And the other thing that changed when they moved from the impulse control disorder to addiction disorder is they removed one of the criteria, which was committing illegal acts. There was a thought that not everybody who has a gambling disorder commits illegal acts, so they took it out for further review. It may show up again in another revision, but for now it's out. And that reduced the number of criteria from 10 to 9. And a person must meet 4 of the 9 criteria, which is a pretty high threshold when you compare it to substance addiction, where I believe it's 2 or 3. These are the criteria. They'll look very familiar to you if you're treating substance use disorder. The 2 that kind of stand out, and we have them in red because they're significant, is one is around chasing, where a person will go. You'll hear maybe they'll go, say, to the casino. They'll spend a couple $100. You'll hear them, I need to go back and get my money back. So that's chasing. When somebody's talking about going and getting their money back, that's kind of an irrational thought process, and that's a red flag that you want to tune into and learn more about. And the other is, relying on others to relieve a desperate financial situation. So this is a bailout. A bankruptcy could be considered a bailout, so we want to be cautious around bankruptcy. We're not, but we also want to be cautious about giving financial advice, because none of us, or at least I can speak for myself, I'm not a financial advisor, and I don't want to get myself involved in any kind of lawsuit for trying to do so. So we don't want to do that, but we do want to warn folks about the role of a bailout and how that could be particularly a high risk situation. Because you think about human nature, and you just think about credit cards and how we treat credit cards. If you were to get a bailout and get say a bankruptcy, and all of a sudden you realize, like, I don't have any debt, I'm clear, and you can kind of start over. And we see that is the case. And if you're not addressing the gambling disorder, you're really setting yourself up for potential relapse. So it is a high risk factor. And then it can be the exclusionary criteria is it's not a part of a manic episode associated with bipolar. Not to say that people who have bipolar disorder can't have a gambling disorder as well, which we see often. But if it's only happening in the manic state and it's not happening in the other states, then it would not be considered a gambling disorder. But like I said, many times it's really hard for people to shut that off. So there are some distinct differences that I think we need to keep in mind. And here are some of them. It's intermittent reward system. So unlike substances or other addictions, when you go and you play, it's not guaranteed if you're going to win or not. So we don't know if that reward is going to happen. It's not self-limiting. So there's nothing, your body's not going to shut down if you ingest too much or you involve yourself in the behavior too much. You can play for as long as you possibly can. There's no biological test. We're not ingesting any kind of chemical. So there's nothing that would show. So it's easier to hide. And there's this really important piece to tune into is fantasies of success and magical thinking. So fantasies of success would be, if I just play one more time, I might be able to get a windfall and I could pay my rent. Now, I've never heard that with somebody who uses heroin. They said, if I just use one more time, I can pay my bills. But with gambling, that is something that we do here, and that's something that has shown some truth for some people. So it closely ties into, is it the problem or the solution? And we get caught into this trap. So it's something that can be particularly challenging, and I think it's something that we have to be mindful of. We've talked about the financial problems. Family anger can be intense just because of the hidden nature of it. Oftentimes when people do reveal that they have a gambling disorder, it's quite dire situation. People may be in a crisis situation, and family can feel like they've lost trust. They can feel betrayed, and the anger can be quite significant. Less public awareness. I think we can all agree that we do a fairly decent job at educating people about tobacco cessation, tobacco use, and drug use, and alcohol use, but we don't do the same for gambling. So we have less public awareness. And then the other piece is that a lot of times governments sponsor gambling, so the message gets a little bit mixed for some individuals who feel that if it's government sponsored, it must be safe. And then the problem or the solution, we talked about that. And we'll talk about near miss briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Fred. So the near miss is something that's unique to gambling as well, and it kind of goes back to that intermittent reward in a way. And you have this example where if you're setting a slot machine, you get a cherry in a bar, and what happens in the brain of a person who gambles on a regular basis is, you can see at the bottom here, where the brain still kind of registers it almost like a win. So if you look at a brain image, there's some activity happening there that doesn't happen in the controls, or folks who don't gamble on a regular basis. So the controls are probably, if you think of the spectrum, there may be the social gambler, people who don't gamble. So if they see this, they say it's a loss. It's a loss is a loss. But if I'm somebody who gambles on a semi-regular basis, maybe a serious social gambler or higher, my brain is going to start to register that differently. So that starts to talk about the changes in the brain functioning of the addiction. And that's quite significant because it's built into a lot of the games, the industry. You know, it's built into slot machines, it's built into to scratch off tickets, you know, and you think about that near miss or that near win really keeps people engaged, you know, because if I'm sitting at a machine and I'm a gambler and I see this happen, I'm not going to get up and walk away. I'm going to continue to play because my chance is coming. I start to feel like I'm going to win. So I think it's quite significant. And this is just this highlights that. You'll see on the right-hand side where that near miss still has a little bit of activity. So there is that reward that's happening regardless of the actual win. And now I'll turn over to Fred.
All right, Jeremy, thank you very much. All right, I want to start with talking about the pathways of gambling. So on this first slide, the main things I want to illustrate is that we can be predisposed in many ways based.
Oh, Fred. Whoops.
I've had an early big win. And whenever I am in a particular environment, I think about gambling or
You're cutting out.
Yeah, you're cutting in and out. I can't hear you.
whole by trying to get money back or trying to be made whole emotionally through the behaviors, it can become problematic. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the specific pathways. And one thing I want you to keep in mind as I talk about the pathways is as we go from 1 to 3, the amount of co-occurring disorders increases. So go ahead, Jeremy, head over to the next slide. Okay, pathway 1. So is behaviorally conditioned. Now this is where we're seeing gambling stand alone. So there's no pre-existing comorbid disorders. Gambling is more linked to reinforcement contingency. So as I was talking about earlier, so, you know, it's positive within my environment, it's positive within my family, I've had some early big wins, and as the behavior occurs further and further, I'm developing some cognitive distortion. So if I'm a lottery player, I may feel like I have a system that is better than what others have. So although the lottery is random, it's based on chance, because I've had some wins based on the system that I've created, I'm luckier than the average player. So cognitive distortions, as Jeremy illustrated before, is important to address in the work that we do. So pathways 1 is just gambling standalone. If we take a look at pathway 2, the emotional vulnerable, so now we're adding a co-occurring behavioral health disorder, mental health related here. So mood disorders, co-occurring depressive disorders, trauma-related challenges. So what we're seeing with individuals here is there's some challenges with coping skills. Now, when I deal with my depression, one of the ways that I cope with it is to go play the slot machines. So when I'm over at the slots, I'm not thinking about gambling. I'm not thinking about my mental health challenges. I'm thinking about gambling, and it helps me to cope with my issues. And, when Jeremy and I do our work, we encourage folks to keep their substance use disorder hat on because of the similarities there, where somebody might be using alcohol to cope with some of those challenges that they're working through. In this case, they're utilizing gambling. So we're seeing history of childhood disturbances, and there's some traumatic life events that gambling is helping them cope with. So pathway 1, remember, gambling alone. 2 adds the comorbid mental health disorder, and pathway 3 will add the element of addiction as well. And also with antisocial personality traits. So as we mentioned earlier, the higher levels of gambling within the criminal justice system, someone that is having the challenges there would be considered pathway 3. And even looking at neurological challenges. So somebody that's struggling with ADHD. So now, most of the times I may have challenges in environments where I'm having a hard time with stability. But when I play poker, I feel like I'm in the zone. I feel like I can concentrate. So as we go up in the pathways, we're seeing just additional challenges that our clients are working through. Okay, so having the conversation. So my friends out there that are in the prevention field and my friends in the clinical field, I want you to think about this. So as you're doing your outreach, clinical folks, as you're doing your assessments, see if there's any room to include having the conversation. And what we encourage is to have the non-judgmental conversations first before you go to evidence-based assessments. Something we like to encourage is, have you ever won anything? So if you think about somebody that might be gambling often, if they've had their wins over time, they might be more likely to talk about it than if you go to something that is perceived more negative, starting off with criteria-based assessing. The second one, what do you like to do for fun? So if within your clinical assessment, you're assessing for leisure activities, add some gambling type of behaviors. Do you play slots? Do you play the lottery, Keno, cards for money? We're seeing more and more of the integration of gambling within gaming. So do you bet on esports? Do you purchase loot boxes? So have the opportunity to have gambling type of behaviors in an area where you're already assessing for leisure activities. Are there events or gatherings where you wager or place bets with family members or friends? One of the initiatives we have within Connecticut is working with the Asian American Pacific Islander Ambassadors Program. And what we've learned from our ambassadors is that culturally, gambling is so ingrained. When folks are getting together for gatherings or weddings or funerals, gambling is often associated with the behaviors there. So if somebody has a strong cultural element to gambling, they might be likely to bring it up if you ask in this way. How long have you been gambling? And think about just with substances. The longer I'm using substances, the more likely it could be problematic later on in life, or the earlier I started, I should say. Same thing with gambling. So the earlier I start, the more problematic it could be later on in life. When did you first experience gambling? When we do our live presentations, this is a question that we'll often ask the group and have them discuss with others. And with our experience, it's amazing the amount of stories that come with gambling, whether it's for somebody personally, whether it's from their family, whether it's from their community. There's always some sort of a link there. Acknowledging during certain times of the year, when sports are more prevalent. I know right now through our coronavirus crisis, sports aren't as prevalent now, but when they are, during times of the Super Bowl, big horse racing, the NCAA basketball tournament, it's an opportunity to have the conversation. During the time, you may want to talk to clients about, what are your thoughts on these events? Are there any behaviors that you participate as you're watching the Super Bowl or some of the other sporting events? To sort of have that non-judgmental conversation. When the lottery jackpot gets high, one example I like to use is, I was pumping gas the other day and I saw a line of people outside the door and I knew the lottery jackpot was high. What do you think about the lottery? Have you ever purchased a lottery ticket? And, it's important to make that distinction because, I know what my experience, when I bring up gambling, most of the times individuals will associate the casino. They won't think about the other variety of forms of gambling that are within their state. And then what fantasy leagues, especially during football where fantasy sports are more prevalent. Ask about fantasy sports. Have you ever participated in fantasy sports? And have that opportunity to have the conversation. So my friends, in prevention, whether you're in Maine or to the other 20 states that are represented in this webinar, it's great to have you all here. Is there room to integrate gambling within your prevention units of the state? Within Connecticut, we've been able to integrate gambling within our prevention unit in the state. And our preventionists in Connecticut are the regional behavioral health action organizations. There are 5 throughout our state. And within their behavioral health objectives are these gambling programs that I'm going to talk about now briefly. In the future, we'll have the opportunity to expand on this, but I just want to briefly highlight the programs here. And as you're hearing it, think about within interventions that you're currently using. This might be something to think about as well, but if there's something you're currently doing, is there ways to integrate it within behavioral health discussions already? So the Gambling Awareness Regional Teams, this brings together folks from prevention, from treatment, people in recovery, stakeholders within the region, and they meet quarterly. And the goal is to have some discussions around gambling. There's usually a presentation that occurs at the meetings, but the amount of collaborations that I've seen come from these meetings, especially during March, which is Problem Gambling Awareness Month, has been profound. Seeing different agencies come together. For the past couple of years, each of the regions of the state have facilitated recovery groups where we've had folks that haven't been involved in the work come to learn about the gambling and how to find resources within the state. For youth prevention, our regional behavioral health action organizations are collaborating with the Capital Regional Education Council within our state. And we've been doing youth projects for years. Over the past few years, we've focused on public service announcement, where youth leaders have come together and created PSAs for the state. And when we were looking at data, we found incredible gains in the amount of awareness that was raised throughout the project, from what youth had known initially to afterwards. And they spend anywhere from 20 to 25 hours creating these videos. So there was a lot of time and emphasis placed on learning gambling. And what we know what prevention is, youth to youth work is certainly positive to making change. The Congregation Assistance Program / Community Awareness Program, which we call CAP for short, is our opportunity to raise awareness about substance use disorders, mental health, suicide awareness, and gambling all into one curriculum, to bring to faith-based leaders, to bring to leaders within the community, because not everybody's going to want to come directly into state-sponsored treatment. And for those that feel more comfortable going to their faith-based leader, it's an opportunity for them to have resources to educate their congregants. So that's an opportunity there. And then our last one here, the Asian American Pacific Islander Ambassadors Program, offers an opportunity to be more culturally appropriate, more comfortable for the community to hear somebody that's coming from their community versus someone like me that's communicating, offers the opportunity to have conversations within native languages. Our ambassadors have used community conversation models. They've integrated gambling into financial literacy programs, and even have offered video reviews where they've showed a video called Paulina that shows the impact of gambling on a Cambodian family and had discussions there. So an opportunity to add programming into the work that's already existed within your state. So for the treatment area, go ahead, Jeremy, go to the next slide. So clinical folks, think about your assessment. What impact has gambling had on your recovery? So if you're somebody that is going to the casino and you have an alcohol use disorder, what impact does going into the environment have on your recovery? Impact on your relationships. We know that gambling has a high correlation with domestic violence. So if you're asking questions about domestic violence, have the opportunity to talk about gambling. In family history, so if you're assessing for other behavioral health related disorders in the family history, include gambling into the conversation. If you're looking at, if you're talking about money, if you have a financial section within your assessment, talk about money. How do you spend your money? Any debt due to gambling? You know, one of the easy
We lost you.
Yeah, give it a second. Sometimes it just self-resolves more quickly than if we put our,
GA, Gamblers Anonymous,
there we
in there, and the equivalent for loved ones impacted is Gam-Anon. All right, go ahead, Jeremy. Okay, so now if you had just one question that talked about do you gamble, I would encourage you to enhance it to something that looks like this. And you could even keep gambling out of the question. Because sometimes stigma can be associated right when somebody hears gambling. So in the past year, have you participated in some of the following? Think about the various types of gambling within your state: Keno, lottery, scratch-offs. Like that previous question that we talked about, integrating gambling into leisure activities. Talk about the variety forms of gambling within your state and have the option for folks to answer. As we're ready to get out there, I'll talk about some of those evidence-based screens that we have on here. So thanks, Jeremy. The Problem Gambling Severity Index. This is a great general assessment survey where if you're in prevention and you're going to recovery events, if you're going to fresh check events, anywhere where you're out in the community and you want to take a snapshot. Today Jeremy is wearing our shirts for survey. So we'll offer the Problem Gambling Severity Index. If somebody takes it, we'll offer them a t-shirt for taking it. And this gives folks the opportunity to see where their gambling resides. There's 9 questions there, and it's on the level of no problems, low, moderate to problematic behaviors. So folks in prevention, this could be a good tool for you. Jeremy, if you move to the next slide, the brief biosocial gambling screen. Clinical folks, this is a popular tool used throughout the nation, and it asks about 3 criteria-based questions. The first one being about withdrawal, the second one being about lying or deceitful behaviors, and the third one being about bailouts. And what research has found is that a yes response to any of these questions may likely indicate disordered gambling. And for clinicians, I would encourage you, if somebody has a yes there, that you look into DSM-5 criteria to see if they meet criteria for gambling disorder. It's challenging to come in, but again, if somebody comes in, we know that folks can get better. 75% of persons treated for gambling disorder substantially reduce their gambling. And even if there's some co-occurring mental health disorders as well, substance use disorders, that treatment can occur. So with the last couple slides before we get to resources, just want to show a little bit of data from Connecticut. Our gambling treatment programs in Connecticut are called the Better Choice Gambling Treatment Programs. And when someone comes in for treatment, they'll complete an intake assessment and a follow-up assessment 6 months afterwards. And within our program, 70% of clients are working through abstinence-related goals, and there's 30% that are working through harm reduction. So those are folks intake to follow-up. Jeremy, if you go over to the next slide, the amount of financial challenges that have occurred from intake to follow-up really decreased dramatically, where upon intake in the past 30 days, around $4,220 were spent. Where at follow-up, it's around $404. And just remember in that number are the 30% that are doing harm reduction related goals. So recovery is possible. So resources within Maine. The Maine Council on Problem Gambling is there with their email address there. For folks throughout the country, the National Council on Problem Gambling can be a resource for you and getting to know your gambling treatment providers within your state. We've been so fortunate to work with Lori Manson, who's been just great throughout this whole process and is a great resource for folks in Maine. Lori's phone number and email address is there. All right, I tried to do the Fred Feta speed round right there, and hopefully that gave us enough time for questions.
Hey, Fred, this is Lori.
Yeah, go ahead, Lori.
Your audio cut out for probably close to a full minute during the slide that was initial screening question.
Oh,
And
I'm so sorry, Lori.
that is such an important one. I'm wondering if you could just really quickly go through that again in case I think we lost a good chunk of it.
Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone.
Oh.
You know, one of the reasons I didn't have my video is we were having some challenges with my audio earlier, and so I was hoping that that would not cause us any issues. But, you know, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, gambling could be considered broad. My technology working was a gamble today. Yeah, let me talk about this one again. So if you had just one question that talked about, do you gamble? You know, we encourage you to enhance that question, because when folks hear gambling, I know what my experience, casinos was the one thing that folks have identified, but there's so much more depending on what's going on in your state. And we find too as well that when gambling is mentioned there might be some stigma associated with it. So if you even have gambling out and ask it with, in the past year, have you participated in any of the following? So talk about some of the gambling behaviors in your state. So Keno, lottery scratch-offs, betting on sports, playing cards for money, going to the casino, off-track betting, daily fantasy sports, purchasing loot boxes and video games. As we know that there is more intersection of gambling within gaming, try to raise that awareness, because, you know, this might be the first time folks have heard about this as a concern. So you're giving them the opportunity to learn more about it. And then to offer responses as none, less than monthly, weekly, or daily. If someone answers anything other than none, assess a bit further. And were folks able to hear me talk about the evidence-based screens? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, we haven't lost you.
You know, the dynamic is really different on a webinar where I'm talking more to my computer rather than folks live. So
I think since we're running short on time, we'll assume that they did unless we see some questions come up about that. So I do see a question on here. Holly is asking, what is the preferred method of treatment for gambling disorder? Is it CBT?
Great question, Holly. So yeah, research has identified that CBT, motivational interviewing, is helpful to treat gambling disorder. Within Connecticut, we have folks that are using EMDR, eye movement desensitization.
Jeremy, it sounds like maybe you're going to have to take, would you mind
Yeah.
taking over?
No, so like Fred had mentioned, you know, CBT, like I mentioned, you know, when we talked about gambling being treated as an addictive disorder, you know, a lot of the same modalities that you're using to treat substance use disorder can apply to gambling disorder. So CBT, emotional interviewing, or MET, and then there's also more and more a body of research coming out to support a module of EMDR that has been found to be highly successful with folks experiencing gambling disorder.
Great. I see another question on there, and this one we could do probably a 4-hour webinar easily, is what has the impact of COVID been on gambling?
Well, interestingly, we have seen a drop in helpline calls for folks seeking treatment. But on the flip side, on the treatment end, we've been seeing not that there's more people seeking treatment on the treatment end, but they're you know, the no-show rates have gone down. The telehealth option has reduced some barriers that some people would find coming into a clinic to receive treatment. So we've seen some positives around the telehealth, and we're hoping that post-COVID, that a lot of these things will still be available for folks so that they can continue to access services, because it is a barrier when you think about having to go into a clinic and you're really, you know, dealing with a highly stigmatized issue, and you know, when you can do it in the comfort of your own home and the privacy of your own home, there's a real appeal there. But we'll see what happens when things start to open up again. You know, in our state, Wednesday is the magical day where everything starts to really reopen on a big scale. So our casinos have opened as of June 1st, and you know, I haven't heard much feedback. I know that there are some people already, you know, starting to call helpline because they're running into some issues, but only time will tell.
Okay, well, we have run out of time. If Fred and Jerry could stay on for another couple moments, just in case there are other questions, I just wanted to tell folks who do need to log off, I wanted to thank you for being here today. Don't forget that I will be sending you that evaluation email this afternoon. And, oh, I'm getting all distracted by all the chimes going off right now. And I will send you out the certificate within 5 business days. And as Jeremy mentioned, we will have a gambling and suicide risk webinar in July. So be watching for that information. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you all.
If you have any further questions, though, hang on for a moment.
Hopefully you heard me say that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on, everyone.